Vivi l'arte con nuove emozioni. Umbria, cuore verde d'Italia.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for being here. I want to thank IJF for sponsoring this extraordinary panel of experts. Before we get into it, I just want to acknowledge and say out loud how rare it is to have a panel focused on national security journalism with all women on it, and I really appreciate IJF making space for us. My name is Kathleen McClellan. I am the co-founder and deputy director of the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program at ExposeFacts. At ExposeFacts, we facilitate investigative journalism in the public interest by providing pro bono legal representation to media sources and whistleblowers. And in our work, we've represented almost a dozen people from within the US drone program. Which brings us to today's topic. We're here to discuss a significant and sobering topic. Over the past decade, drone warfare and targeted killing has become one of the primary tactics the US uses in its counterterrorism strategy. In 2012, the US first officially acknowledged this program. The top counterterrorism official, John Brennan, gave a public speech titled "The Efficacy and Ethics of US Counterterrorism Strategy." He described drones as being unprecedented in their ability to precisely target with surgical precision and laser-like focus. He presented the program as keeping American troops out of harm's way while protecting civilians. He said, "Never before has there been a weapon that allows us to distinguish more effectively between terrorists and civilians." He outlined rigorous standards and process of review and said that we only authorize a strike if we have a high degree of confidence that innocent civilians will not be injured or killed, except in the rarest of circumstances. He said civilian casualties were exceedingly rare. This is how the targeted killing program was presented to the world. Years later, the Trump administration removed internal oversight constraints on the drone program. They expanded strike authority and watered down the standard to prevent civilian casualties. The Biden administration has since put back review standards and re-restricted strike authority. But across all administrations, the US has operated the program largely in secret and routinely underestimated civilian casualties and overestimated the drone's ability to accurately target. And we know this, thanks in large part to the work of the individuals on this panel and the sources and whistleblowers they've worked with. This is an issue with global impact, but these attacks present unique challenges for reporters. from finding and cultivating sources, to protecting sources, to presenting fair and accurate information that reflects different perspectives, including the perspectives of airstrike victims, and getting accurate answers from the US government about its secretive warfare program. And these panelists have been on the front lines of informing the public. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll ask them some questions, and then we'll let you ask them a few questions. First, we have Tatiana Bazzichelli. She is the co-founder and director of Disruption Network Lab, a Berlin-based nonprofit organization that organizes cultural events with the objective of exposing misconduct and wrongdoing of the powerful. Disruption Network Lab sponsored a March 2022 conference called the Kill Cloud, which interlinked the idea of exposing injustice with the debate on warfare whistleblowing. Tatiana also authored the anthology Whistleblowing for Change, Exposing Systems of Power and Injustice. It's a wonderful resource, and it includes contributions of 30 authors in the field of whistleblowing and social justice. Next, we have Lynzy Billing. Lynzy is a British investigative journalist of Afghan-Pakistani origins, and she's been reporting on Afghanistan since 2019. And recently, she published The Night Raids in ProPublica. I'm going to pause for 5 seconds for you to write it down or pull it up on your phone to read later. The Night Raids is a phenomenal piece of investigative journalism, the best I've read in years, and it is a 4-year investigation into the CIA's deadly strategy of funding and equipping Afghan special forces to target perceived enemies in Afghanistan. She spent years crisscrossing violent swaths of Afghanistan to track the fallout of zero units, squads of Afghan soldiers who were funded, trained, and directed by the CIA and joined by US Special Operations Forces on the raids. The investigation has already won awards, the Overseas Press Club's Ed Cunningham Award and Columbia Journalism School's 2003 Meyer Mike Berger Award, and they're well-deserved. So that's your homework. Azmat Khan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter whose work grapples with the human costs of war. She's an investigative reporter with the New York Times and a Birch Assistant Professor at Columbia Journalism School, and where she's also the director of the Lee Center for Global Journalism. Her investigations have prompted widespread policy impact. Her multi-part series in the New York Times, The Civilian Casualty Files, was awarded the 2022 Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting and spurred direct action from the Secretary of Defense, who ordered military officials to overhaul efforts to protect civilians during US combat operations. The project was the culmination of more than 5 years of Khan's reporting, including ground investigation at the sites of more than 100 civilian casualty incidents in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, and more than 1,300 formerly secret military records she obtained in a legal battle with the Pentagon. And last, but certainly not least, in the middle is Sonia Kennebeck. And Sonia is an award-winning director, producer, and investigative journalist. Her documentary film credits in directing include the critically acclaimed feature films, The United States vs. Reality Winner, Enemies of the State, and National Bird. She received the 2023 Chicken and Egg Award for Directors and the 2021 Adrian Shelley Excellence in Filmmaking Award. Her debut feature, National Bird, about the US drone war, was awarded the Ridenhour Documentary Film Prize and an Emmy nomination for Current Affairs Documentary. You're about to hear from the people who've been doing this reporting and protecting their sources best. Source protection is absolutely essential for investigative journalism, and so I think we'll start there. And the first question I have is for you, Azmat. Can you discuss some of the ethical considerations that you think through when you're speaking with victims of airstrikes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a host of them, but I would say a top priority for me has always been the fact that people are opening up their homes to you. They're sitting down to speak to you about the worst traumas that they've ever been through, the worst nights of their lives. And there's a real risk to re-traumatizing them simply by sitting down and asking them questions. And so there's, something that I think all of us have had experience with, which is, trying to really get meaningful consent, that goes beyond, what might be described as informal consent, but meeting someone where they are. Right, so a farmer in a really remote village in southern Kandahar is not familiar with terms like off the record. They're used to things like guest rights, inviting people into their homes, sitting down, giving them a meal, answering questions. And the very act of, asking a sensitive question, you may not be met with, "I'm sorry, I don't think that I can answer that." You can really put people at risk, not just for re-traumatization, but also in terms of persecution by local authorities for speaking up. And so there's an amount of work that goes into that, not just in terms of explaining why you're here and what you're doing and what could happen, where their words and images might be used, not just the fact that they can say no, they can refuse any question you ask. It's explaining the full extent of what the repercussions might be for them, because this is not something they necessarily know. And I would say that's probably a very top ethical issue, but there are so many others, that, I've interviewed many informants, so people who passed on coordinates for airstrikes in the places where I've worked. So back in 2017, I published a 2-year investigation that was based on a ground sample of airstrikes. And instead of what the coalition claimed in terms of its civilian death rate from these airstrikes, which was less than 1%, 0.01, I found a rate on the ground that was 1 in 5, which was 31 times higher than what our government was claiming. Not just 2 times, 3 times, 4 times as high, 31 times. And to really get to the bottom of that is that you have to interview people who were responsible, not just pushing the buttons from far away or directing aircraft, but people who passed on coordinates, the intelligence behind this, and that can that can pose its own risks in terms of security and compromising them.
That's great, thanks. And this brings me to a question for you, Lynzy. When you're working on a long investigative piece like the night raids, that presents unique challenges. Can you talk a little bit about how you cultivate sources when situations change throughout the course of your stories?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the soldiers that I spoke to for the story, when it started out, were still going on operations every other night. They were telling me after they'd gone on an operation where they were and what happened. And so meeting them while they're doing operations and figuring out how to be careful with that logistically, how to meet up with them, how to figure out ways to sneak them out of a base and meet them off a highway in the back of a car at night and swap SIM cards was already a risk for the soldiers at the beginning. And then fast forward to the Taliban taking over Afghanistan, 3 years later, the risks for them completely changed. So they were now under threat from the people that they were supposed to be targeting in the first place. And so I think when you're dealing with a really long-term story, like 4 years, whether it's the Afghan soldiers or the Americans, you're constantly checking in and you're constantly figuring out whether you should still be meeting this person and how to do it safely. But also you make calls there's a lot of people who don't end up in the story because you make a call as a journalist where you say what they shared and the truths that they shared and the evidence that they shared is useful for us to know for the story, but I'm not going to put them in at this point. So.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And it leads perfectly into my question for Sonia. You work in documentary film with subjects over quite long periods of time as well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about consent. Azmat mentioned that earlier, but what does it mean to get consent from sources, and does that change over time? And how do you handle that with the subjects of your films?
Yeah, I think informed consent, as you already said, is crucial. And, or even when you go back to the very beginning of your research, I think it's very important for all journalists who work in the field of national security to come very prepared. So that means that you have to do substantial research, I think, before you contact any of your sources. You have to understand the threat level of the research that you want to do. I always try to do a threat assessment at the beginning of research and really understand what could be the worst case scenarios. And because especially if we work with national security, whistleblowers, people who've worked within the US government in particular, who've had security clearances, the first contact is already the moment that, could compromise everything. So I think you have to know the risk before you start reaching out to people. So when I did my film about the US drone war, I started by doing document research, like extensively, and I collected research. I really wanted to know what was already public and what could we safely talk about, because knowing that I'm doing a documentary film and filming over many, many years, I did not believe that I could have an anonymous source and protect an anonymous source if the adversary is the US government. So, and you cannot expect and put, I think, the sort of the onus onto the source, but you as the journalist, I believe, have a responsibility to try as much as possible to protect your source. But then, as part of the informed consent, I try to explain all of the risks. And I also, when I reached out to, and I found the whistleblowers in my film, people who worked within the drone program, I told them that there is a risk. I would never say, I can protect you. I said, I'm trying to minimize the risk, but I think there is a risk. And so the decision they have to make is, are they willing to take that risk? And that for me is really what you were also talking about, Azmat, and informed consent, explaining, not just like giving a sheet of paper with legal language they might not understand, because I have trouble understanding all of this legal language. So really explaining the consequences and talking sort of the scenario through beginning to end. And then I also work with attorneys. So Kathleen and I have known each other for a very long time, because before I was really filming and working with my sources, I had reached out to Kathleen and Jesslyn Radak to inform myself about the risks, where the line is, what could we safely talk about, and I asked them if they would represent my sources, if they wanted to have legal representation. And that is legal representation independently of my own legal representation. So there is sort of a barrier in a way. So that for me is informed consent.
Thanks, Sonia. And Tatiana, you're coming at this from a little bit of a different place as more of an advocate, and but some of the very valuable work that you do is building this network of trust for whistleblowers and sources. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you do that and how that helps people speak to journalists.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I would like to thank you, Kathleen, for organizing this, and also the International Journalism Festival for having us. I think it's very important we are doing this panel, and also thanks for the audience of being here. And so to speak a bit about the work we do at the Disruption Network Lab, we actually come after all the colleagues that you see in this kind of panel are doing, have done their important work, because our work is to try to bring whistleblowers in contact with other expertise, like activists, artists, journalists, but at the same time also with the public. So in a sense, this comes with a responsibility, because of course, as we know, there is a discourse of security that has been already described, but also there is a risk of having a person suddenly speaking in front of an audience and not often being also necessarily a professional speaker that has been spoken a lot in front of a public. And so it's very important, first of all, to collaborate among us. I think that also this kind of network of trust exists also among the organizations that are doing this kind of work. And specifically, what we do at the Disruption Lab is to organize conferences, to develop projects, and also to do publications that have to do with whistleblowing, but also with the idea of exposing systems of power and injustice. And for doing that, of course, you have to create also a trust with the whistleblowers. And this is a slow process. Also, it's a slow process to organize a conference as we do. Sometimes take 2 years because you need also to do an investigation. You need to understand is important to bring to the audience such a topic, and why I'm actually inviting this person to speak. Because as part of this job, there is also an expectation that the speakers have and the whistleblowers to, in a sense, make an impact. And they also come from a situation that is very difficult because, as I say, we come after a lot of time passed, and there is also the situation that the media have been spoken a lot about these people, but then we also know that the whistleblowers are often also left in isolation or persecution. So this is very important to connect with organizations that are doing advocacy of whistleblowing. And in that sense, we also try to create relations that is very personal with the whistleblowers. So, you know, to have a long conversation before, to also develop a friendship, and we have a lot to learn as well, because we have to listen to them. We try not to impose a topic or a subject, but we try first of all to understand why you want to speak about this, what you want to say, and also to listen what they would suggest, because I think also the whistleblowers are often the best networker ever. For example, I want to mention Lynzy Billing, that was part of the US drone program, and I mean, I think she is one of the best networker I know, and also thanks to her, also we enter in contact with other whistleblowers. Also thanks to other organizations, we enter in contact with Brandon Bryan, for example, through Sean Westmoreland, actually we enter in contact with Lynzy Billing. So are also the whistleblowers themselves that are building up this network of trust.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, you know, what I'm hearing from you all is leading really to my next question. You know, there's a real challenge to get fair and accurate reporting on these airstrikes because, you know, they're ordered from, you know, a place in Washington, they're carried out with a global network of surveillance, and then the victims are often in places where the journalists are not. And so, you know, one thing I've noticed about your reporting, Lynzy and Azmat, is you do a brilliant job of sort of keeping the human factor in the story, and it's a real skill to do that on all levels. And just as Tatiana is, you know, treating the whistleblowers like people and not just sources, you know, I'd like for Azmat and Lynzy to talk about how you do that. How do you keep the human factor in these stories, especially when you're talking about, you know, surveillance and technology and, you know, casualty numbers? How do you keep it clear that the casualty numbers are human people?
So I think the key to that is to really try to render people's lives, actions, experiences meaningful. And that means going beyond just the night in which they lost loved ones. It means telling us about their lives, telling us about what they had before all of that went away. And you can do this from a distance, but I really think there's something that we lose when we don't do ground reporting, which is that local context. It is that intimacy, it's that human connection, which when you're able to convey, when you sit down and you say, you know, this is the daughter of Bassem Razo the night before this strike. This was her, you know, with a firework that she was playing with in her garage. This was, you know, where they went, you know, on family vacations, or, you know, really taking the time to get to know people's lives and seeing them beyond just that trauma, putting it in context, but also, this is where it's like very important, I think, is you tell all of that, but you also give it ground to stand on. You vet your sources, you verify what you can, you go to great lengths to get whatever government it is that you are investigating either to respond, and ideally also, you know, you obtain documents, data, information, whether that's from informants and whistleblowers, or whether that is through lawsuits, you know, using the Freedom of Information Act in the United States. But all of that allows you to put their stories forward in a way that they've been extremely vetted, right? You've been able to investigate this, you know, using technologies and open source tools, but also some of, and this is what I think is so important, if I'm trying to drill this down into one thing, it's this. So often, these human voices are rejected as non-credible because our governments claim that they have classified information that we don't have access to, that their secret information is superior to these people on the ground. And so very often you'll see people interview people on the ground and then have those voices shut down on that basis, that we have intelligence, you don't. We can't tell you what it is, but we have it. And so for me, to really give those human voices the ground to stand on meant also extracting information from my government, interrogating it in whole, like obtaining, thousands of formerly secret military records, and really putting that in context to show this recurring pattern of failure. It wasn't just that, this death rate is 31 times higher than what our government is claiming. It's showing that over and over and over again, they made the same intelligence mistakes. This stuff that they claim is classified and something they can't reveal and superior to people on the ground, I was able to show is not the case, and that renders those human voices. It allows the readers and the audience to resonate with that all the much more.
Yeah, I think if anyone here has investigated or looked into anything related to CIA activities, it's a dark and murky and confusing world and a complete black box when it comes to getting documents or getting information on it. For me, I was always going to report from the ground up. It was always about spending years in Afghanistan talking to people who nobody had bothered to talk to, and like Azmat mentioned, at times didn't believe if they went to local provincial offices and said what had happened on these operations. And so, I was back in Afghanistan looking into a nighttime raid which killed my mother and sister years earlier, when I met a woman who told me about her 2 sons getting shot point blank on a nighttime raid. And she had no money and no resources and no one to turn to, really. She was a widow. She didn't have anyone to talk to figure out why her sons had been targeted. And I think that at the end of the day, these whole stories are built on the fact that people don't have answers as to why their families were targeted. And I get that. I understand for her that she has no way to move on and grieve what's happened, because no one is willing to tell her why her sons were incorrectly targeted, and nobody wants to acknowledge that there's failures of intelligence, or why, like Azmat says, there's a pattern of these failures from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, why it's the same story of classified operations. These are Title 50, they're covert operations. They don't have to tell anything to anyone about what happens. So really, these are people's stories, they're their lives, and they are the starting point, and they should be the through line through all the stories. Everything else in corroborating and verifying it is just additional to saying that we should believe them, we should listen to them. And America's left Afghanistan, there's no accountability, but these stories haven't gone anywhere. You can go into any village and you'll find countless more witnesses and survivors and families of victims who are saying, I want to tell you what happened because no one's bothered to come and ask me.
Sonia, did you want to add a little bit about your work in this area? I know National Bird also featured victims, but as well as people who'd served within the program. That's a fascinating human factor. And then Tatiana, I thought maybe you could add about working with certain sources and whistleblowers to get information sort of directly to the public and how you do that.
Yeah, the human factor in films, I think, is really at the core, because at least the films that I tell are the stories of people, and then through the personal stories, I convey information, or they convey it, but it's really their stories, it's very personalized, and the intent is to, I do believe in teaching and educating people, and it's much easier to listen to someone who you have a connection to, that is with the whistleblowers, who are then also explaining the details of their jobs, which is very technical, and I see my job as an investigative journalist and a filmmaker to break down information. I like to have a very low barrier of entry. I don't like to make my work for other journalists, but for a wide general public to, understand the complex issues of our society and our time. And yeah, and the human factor is the most important. And then in Afghanistan as well, so my film connects the explanation of the drone program, the US drone program, with the people who are most impacted, who have been targeted by airstrikes. And I also had the experience that when we reached out to people and contacted them, and I researched a number of different cases, but I decided to only film the families impacted by one specific strike, because when you film and I think a camera's in your face, it's all very distressing, even more than I think an interview without camera and sound recording, and I didn't want to put people through that experience with, not knowing that they would be in the film. So I really had to be sure that the people that I interviewed would be in my film. And yeah, when I asked them, they really wanted to talk, because no one had asked them for their perspective. And then, Azmat, when you were just talking about the documents, so I selected one specific strike because the military did an investigation on it. And it was the ACLU had done a Freedom of Information Act. I'm not sure if they did it through a lawsuit or so, but they had gotten the documents, thousands of pages. And I worked through it, and then I compared the information to the testimonies of the survivors, and I found a lot of mistakes or intentional, wrong classifications, crosses that were made at the wrong, parts on the document. Sometimes and this strike was thoroughly invested. It's known as the Organised attack. So at some point in some of the documents, it actually said that the reason is unknown, or the documents themselves were inaccurate. And that's why I encourage everyone to do this document research, but also scrutinize it and really make sure that you do fact-checking and don't just believe everything that the government puts out.
Yeah, for me it's important to reflect and also to bring this kind of personal experience with Brandon Bryant, for example, because I think if we root it to what we experience with these sources, is also more understandable. He was the person that we invited first in our program for a conference that was called Drones, was April 2015. And in that time, he was really full of passion. Brandon was a sensor operator in the US drone program, and he really believed in this act of whistleblowing, in the fact that people could be inspired, could listen to him. He came to Berlin, and he really, literally inspired really large public. I remember that after a year, still people were telling me how important was his presence in our town. But then, and here I think comes the responsibility of all of us, not only people that organize conferences, but also journalists. He lost really faith, because he thought that he fought a lot to make a truth come out, but nothing was really changing. And he felt that the impact was not strong enough. And after 7 years, I thought that it was important to hear his voice again and to invite him again at the Disruption Lab, because the general impression was that, of course, whistleblowers are very important for news outlets because they bring along a story that has not been told, but after the news is gone, these people are completely, left alone. So then advocacy has to intervene, other organization, to try to bring again this perspective forward. So he actually initially didn't want to come to speak, and it was totally understandable, but at the end he decided, okay, I come. And again, his speech was so touching that there were even people crying in the audience, and he was also feeling very strong again. And I think this is very important to think about, because at the end we are dealing with people that went really through a lot, they suffer a lot, and it's the responsibility of all of us to really understand what they went through and the importance of the truth that they revealed. And I think we really have to reflect also how to create a long tail of the stories that the whistleblower say and want to tell the public, and I think is a shared responsibility. For example, at the Disruption Lab, we published this book, Whistleblowing for Change, that is made of 30 very personal stories, and the people that we invited to speak are not only whistleblowers, but also artists, activists, investigative journalists, and we are all reflecting why to blow the whistle. What is the mindset that brings us all together in terms of impact? And I think this is really also something very important to reflect. Why are we actually doing this job? Why we connect with these people? Why is it important to have them among us? And also hear directly their voice, not just represent them, but really invite them again in festival and situation. Of course, if they feel to do it, to not forget them, because the price that they paid was really high and is always really high.
Thank you. That's, getting information from the government is a unique challenge in this area. And, one of the ways that you can get information is from the official government sources, and then the other way is from unofficial government sources, often whistleblowers who are sometimes traumatized themselves, sometimes putting themselves at tremendous risk. And so I was wondering if, Sonia and Azmat and Lynzy, you could talk a little bit about how you go about weighing that information, which can often be contradictory and different. How do you credit information you get from official government sources, and how do you verify information you might get from whistleblowers?
So in the case of my drone war documentary, I had 3 people who worked within the drone program with top secret clearances, and I actually still double and triple checked all the information that they presented in interviews. So, and it really helped as well in asking the right questions, that I was very informed when I started doing the filming and the interviews. I really wanted to know what could they safely talk about. And also what we talked earlier about the impact on, and the human factor. So one of my lead characters, and that is the risk when you work with national security, whistleblower government sources. He was raided during the production of the film. We much later on found out it had nothing to do with the film, but he was also a source of classified documents. His name is Daniel Hale. He is still in prison today. Kathleen and Jesslyn Radak are representing him. He's their client, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about him. But it is very high risk. So you cannot go into this type of reporting lightly. I think you have to be extremely well prepared. I do encourage everyone in here to do this type of reporting, because we need more. We need to dig, and we need this type of information, because otherwise we don't have accountability. And especially for airstrikes, we need accountability. So do it, but do it well prepared, please.
So on that note, there's a variety of different government sources, right? You have the very top officials, right, that will respond to particular things, and that can be useful in some ways, but oftentimes it is the government trying to give you their narrative, trying to refute your findings. But you get that. You can also get like an embed, right? So at some point I was able to visit the US air base in Qatar, from which the drone war and these airstrikes in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, that's a nerve center for a lot of these airstrikes that are taking place. And I was able to visit after a lot of no's, and first telling me you can't come, or delaying the visit, and finally telling me I couldn't come unless I gave them the IP address of every electronic device I was going to take in. And and I said, fine, I won't bring any electronic devices into the country. And then they said, will you sign a statement to that effect? And I said, yes, I will. And the same day that I landed in Qatar, so did my little sister with a lot of electronic devices. But there was that version of it, and you get their sort of, here's how we do this air campaign. And it was useful for me to kind of get a play-by-play of what they say they go through and their accounting of it, because I can now fact check it, right? I can try to verify if what they're saying is true, is what's happening. And then each rung lower as you go, you'll find, people who are imagery analysts who said, is just like she had a number of imagery analysts in her film. I was speaking to a lot of imagery analysts, and then something that surprised me, and I'd encourage those of you who are doing this reporting, is you don't have to publish a 5-year investigation or a 4-year. You can do some reporting, and in many ways you can go fishing. And sources will come to you based on something that you've published, right? And so I remember after The Uncounted came out in 2017, a number of people that I never would have expected to reach out to me came to me, and they were like, I want to tell you about this airstrike that we did on a dam in Syria that nearly led to its collapse and the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. I'm concerned about that. Or, and these are like true examples, or people who, somebody senior that I never would have expected, but they really liked, the investigation I'd done, that I'd gone on the ground to check this, that they weren't doing that, and they were like, you're working on this, I want to talk to you. And so there were a number of people that came forward like that. In terms of how I use them in stories, it depends. I try to be so careful about not, it goes back to centering the human stories, like that is the priority for me. If you have both, I don't want to create this false equivalence in which I'm putting, the woes of someone who's involved in this and feels a lot of guilt and trauma about it on an equal sort of platform as somebody who's been on the receiving end of that. That doesn't mean it's not a story worth telling, but I might tell that separately, and certainly in the way Sonia has done, which if you haven't watched her film, National Bird, highly recommend. But I will say that I will try to, for them, get in some quotes of things that they may have said where I can get them in so they can see their presence. But some of the people who helped me were internal to this. They helped me make sense of documents. They would basically study with me. These are really, you could find somebody from 5 years before this particular air war started in Iraq and Syria, and they wouldn't even understand these documents. It was very specific to this part of it. And so essentially I would send some documents over, they would read them, I would read them, and the next day we'd talk about them. And they just did such an incredible service. Like, I studied, I got better because people I never would have expected wanted to talk to me and cared about seeing their country doing better. So it's a variety of things. And then there's informants on the ground who passed on coordinates, who would share those with me, and I would check and verify that, yeah, this is like the date that they sent these on, and then there was an airstrike on this particular date, and I would verify this, I would sit down to interview them, and so it was a lot of different people, and there's many ways into this.
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned is everybody wants to tell you that they know what they're talking about and give you information on something when it's not their area. And for me, I just want to go to as many people as possible. I did 350 interviews for this story and we're still going. I still need to do more. But the reality is that a CIA officer doesn't know what someone working with the processing of intelligence knows, and a soldier on the ground doesn't understand how targeting packages are built. And everybody has a different puzzle piece, and you need all of them, and you need to get obsessive and get into understanding everyone's separate world so that you could put it all together to understand why these operations and these activities happen the way they do. And so you need whistleblowers with all their separate expertise and sources, and soldiers from all different backgrounds. They need to understand where they're coming from, why they join these operations, why do they work with intelligence, and so for me it's just about more. I'm always like more people to talk to.
That's great. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience left. If you could raise your hands. Why don't we take a couple, and then there's one here and one over there, and if we can get both questions, and then we'll answer.
Hi, thank you all so much for this incredible panel. I have a question for Lynzy, Sonia, and Azmat. Actually, I have two questions. One question is, so you guys have talked about the extent that you go to in order to protect your sources and how difficult it is to provide as informed consent as possible, and sometimes there are dire repercussions. So have you encountered instances in which you weren't able to protect these sources? And in those cases, do you feel that there was anything else you could have done? And the second question is, at this festival, there have been a lot of conversations about like mental health, vicarious trauma, and moral injury. And I'm wondering, doing this kind of work that you do, which is very intense, very like on the ground, very immersive, what, I guess, drives you to continue to work on these investigations year after year? Are there any times when you felt it was difficult to continue? And do you have any practices in place to make this kind of work sustainable for you?
Or doing all three. Great, thank you so much. It's very inspiring work that you've all done, and I think what it makes me think about is sort of how you view accountability and what that means to you, because I think there are multiple dimensions to it, right? There's like making these acts known and making these atrocities known and part of the public record, and having the people who lived through it feel validated in having their experiences be heard by the whole world. There's also having that both in the countries in which these atrocities occurred and for those communities themselves, but also in the countries where these drone operators are from. But then there's also maybe like a consequentialist dimension to accountability, where you want to ideally stop these things from happening again in the future. So given how multifaceted accountability is, I was wondering sort of which dimension of it is most important to you?
You want to go ahead?
I didn't hear the question well, if you can resay.
So his question was about how do you measure accountability and what aspect of accountability is most important?
Yeah, of course, as I said before, organizing conferences, you have a responsibility. But as I say, I think the biggest responsibility that we also have is to consider the impact of a whistleblowing act, and first of all, not to put these people in danger by, creating situations that could happen, but at the same time also make sure that certain acts are not forgotten. And I think this discourse of accountability actually is a shared responsibility. And allow me also to say, perhaps I want to also give a comment in general to the fact that we really don't have to forget acts done by people that pay really a big price. For example, in this festival, I'm not seeing a panel about Julian Assange, and I think we are all accountable in considering the fact that WikiLeaks has been one of the important sources in the past 10 years also for journalism. And this person is in prison since 4 years and has been persecuted for 10 years and more. So it's really our responsibility to bring this legacy on, keep speaking about these people, And of course, we have to understand the level of responsibility in what can be told, what cannot. But for sure, our biggest responsibility, I think, is not to forget. So I really hope also that at the next year festival, there will be panels about Julian Assange, because I think this was really missing this time.
Thanks for that. So I think we're 99.9% out of time, but if one of you wanted to quickly answer one of her questions with just like 1 or 2 lines, if you think we can do that, I don't want to neglect.
I can, in terms of, so kind of the 2 questions actually that you were just asking are connected for me, kind of what you can do to protect your sources and also your mental health and the mental health of your team and your sources. So when I give source protection workshops, that's actually like all I cover, like all the different aspects, which include in the preparation, the worst case scenarios, and I do over-prepare, and I actually recommend to everyone to over-prepare. So encrypt your communication, encrypt your hard drives, and everyone on your team should be knowledgeable about that as well. And yeah, really try to think through what could possibly happen. And that's what I did in the case also of Daniel Hale, who was then raided by the FBI. And in terms of mental health, I do think that journalists are exposed to a lot of trauma, and I strongly believe in peer-to-peer support, having a trusted community, people who who you trust to share information with. I usually work, because I'm a filmmaker, I work with a crew, I check in with them. The editors are often the ones who can be most traumatized because they repeatedly watch traumatizing images. So make sure you check in with everyone, and also build your support network. I think it's crucial to do this job in the long term.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I very appreciate it.